Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ohana Oliveira, and I'm the Director of Programs and Outreach at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Before we begin today's event, first of all, I want to apologize for the tech issues. I think it's a wider Zoom issue, but I'm glad we got that resolved and we're able to get going. There is simultaneous translation available, and that can be accessed by clicking the globe icon for interpretation at the bottom right of your Zoom window. Should be beside the Q&A button. We also encourage you to provide questions throughout the presentation using that Q&A function, and then we'll respond to them later in the program. Before we begin, I'd want to acknowledge the land that which we live on. The purpose of land acknowledgements are to provide recognition and respect for the first peoples of this land. The Canadian Race Relations Foundation acknowledges the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis. We also acknowledge Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'd also like to acknowledge the land on which our panelists are coming to us from. Our panelists are coming to us from the traditional and unceded territory of the Stalo people, the Simath, and the Mathqui First Nation. We thank them for having cared for these lands and waters since time out of mind, and look forward to working with them in partnership as we continue to build a great city together. The Canadian Race Relations Foundation and the Sikh Heritage BC are jointly presenting this event to you on Sikh Heritage Month, celebrating the legacy of activism of Sikh Canadians. Please note that due to some unforeseen circumstances, we have a slight change in our programming, so we're unable to provide the virtual tour, but instead we'll be doing a presentation. Today, Sharanjit Kaur Sandhra, co-curator of exhibits at Sikh Heritage Museum, will lead a presentation on a tour of the Sikh Heritage Museum located in the National Historic Site, Gersik Temple in Abbotsford, BC. She'll highlight and utilize heritage and history to forge stronger connections to anti-racism. Following the presentation, Sharanjit will be joined by Imroze Singh, art curator for Sikh Heritage BC, for fireside chat to discuss the intersections of Sikh faith, anti-oppression, learning, and anti-racism. But before that, I'll pass the virtual mic to Mohammed Hashim, CRRF's executive director, to say a few words.
Thank you, Ohana. My name is Mohammed Hashim, and I'm honored to be here. I'll do a quick land acknowledgement of my own. So I am also speaking to you from the Treaty 13 lands with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. But whenever I do a land acknowledgement, I typically try to share something more than just a land acknowledgement, because I think it's important for us to keep in mind the reconciliation isn't just about acknowledging whose land it is, but to share the experiences of those whose land this land belongs to. And I just wanted to share a quick story about a gentleman named Dwayne Yelony, who I met 3 weeks ago in Ottawa, and he comes from Big Stone First Nation, Cree First Nation, up in northern Alberta. And he's, a youth counselor. He's a mental health crisis support worker. And it was his first time being in Ottawa when I met him 3 weeks ago. And it was a different world to him, because to him, he's living in a community crisis. His reserve has 2,000 people, out of which 20 have committed suicide since the beginning of this year. And that's a number from 3 weeks ago. Of the 20 who have, 5 of them were between the ages of 12 to 18. In my family, we have doctors, lawyers, engineers. So the kids grow up thinking they could also be doctors, engineers, and lawyers. Because that's who they have around them. The greatest predictor of suicide amongst kids in those communities is whether their own family members have committed suicide. There's some of us in this world who are being brought up to believe that we can be doctors and lawyers and engineers, and others who are being brought up to believe that they need to hate themselves. This is what Canada has created through our colonial history. I want to acknowledge their pain and the land, but also the people who this land belongs to. And with that, I want to, start talking about Sikh Heritage Month. It's not only an opportunity for us to reflect on the countless contributions and accomplishments of Sikh Canadians, but it's also honestly a time to reflect on the issues and struggles facing Sikh communities today, and which we at the foundation are working hard alongside with many other groups and organizations to eradicate. The painful experiences by Sikh communities with regards to racism are far too many to talk about. Unfortunately, many racist incidents against Sikhs are perpetuated till this very day. Of recent, Dr. Brinda Narang featured on CBC's Vancouver's evening news broadcast to discuss the province's vaccine rollout, was subjected to an onslaught of racist insults on social media. He's a doctor. Racist vandalism of the Gurdwara Guru Amarnath Darbar Sikh Society and Kelowna, British Columbia. The racist graffiti was in 2018. And there's been so many more. But I also want to say that it's really hard to define anti-Sikh racism because there's not really a term called anti-Sikh racism. So so when there's Islamophobia, we know that's impacting Muslims, but Islamophobia also impacts Sikhs. The first people that were killed in a hate crime after 9/11 were Sikhs. And it's both the, whenever I speak to my Sikh friends, no one ever says, well, no, it's not me, it's them, we're different. I've never ever heard that from any Sikh person ever. And also when there's Islamophobia, but we know that was an Islamophobic attack because the person said Islamophobic things while they were attacking. And then, but even when there is discussions around Islamophobia, you never see Canadian Sikhs ever try to take up space to say, hold on a second, this impacts us too. Let us help define how to fight it. So there's a sense of humility that is expressed to that by ensuring that people whose voices are not co-opted by anybody else. But what I also think that this points to is a big gap between how do we define anti-Sikh racism? Because I believe much of it is targeted. And without being able to define it properly, public policymakers, police forces, prosecutors don't know how to charge it. And that's a real gap in Canada in terms of addressing anti-Sikh racism. We hope this event will celebrate, the history of Sikh Canadians and give you some thought towards how do we move forward on some of these issues, and but also talk about the activism, because I think Sikhs have been here for much longer than many other communities have, and the contributions have been enormous. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Ohana to then start the program. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, Mohammed. So as Mohammed said, we will now get to our main event. So we get to hear, this is the portion of the event where we get to hear from Sharanjit and Imroze. Sharanjit is the coordinator of the South Asian Studies Institute at the University of the Fraser Valley, co-curator of exhibits at Sikh Heritage Museum, located in Abbotsford, BC, and a sessional faculty in the Department of History at UFV. She is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at UBC and is interested in looking at the affected experience of museum visitors through a critical race theories lens. Sharan's a passionate activist building bridges between community and academia through museum work. She is a past member of the BC Museums Association and currently a director with the Pacific Heritage Center, Museum of Migration. Moderating the fireside chat today is Imroze Singh Deol. Imroze is a design researcher, strategist, and designer. His practice is at the intersection of exploring sociocultural accessibility and its relationship to emerging communities around the world. Imroze's current research is focusing on developing Punjabi-centered design, a framework solution for healthcare accessibility. He is currently the head of strategy and founder at Kosh Health and a lead strategist at 92x2 Media. He is pursuing a master's of design in inclusive design at OCAD, and he is also currently serves as the art curator for Sikh Heritage BC. Very powerful panelists. So now it's over to Sharanjit.
Thank you, Ohana. And thank you, Mohammed, as well, for those introductory remarks. There's a slight change on my bio. I actually defended my dissertation last week, so I'm very proud to say I'm Dr. Sharanjit Kaur Sandhra, and it's apropos that I'm the first Sikh to graduate from the history department with a PhD at UBC as well. So considering it's Sikh Heritage Month, it's something I'm very proud of. Apologies as well for the delay, but I'm really excited about the conversation today and the stories I'm going to share, and the conversation I'm going to have with Imroze, somebody I've known for, gosh, almost 10 years now. So looking forward to the stories and the histories. I'm just going to share my screen so I can show you the images along with a little bit of history. So my conversation today was supposed to be a virtual tour, but unfortunately I am currently in quarantine at home trying to protect everybody else and a lot of Sikhies at home. So we're going to make this into a, just as though we were physically giving a virtual tour through images and stories about a very important site, a site that I'm particularly proud of. It's the Sikh Heritage Museum, National Historic Site Gersik Temple, and fully functioning Gurdwara. But through that history of this national site of significance, I'm going to talk a little bit about activism. I'm going to talk a little bit about racism as well, and Mohammed touched on a few of those concepts. But what I want to emphasize to you all is, you know, it can become really easy to talk about the racism, the quote resiliency, and how communities, many communities like the Sikh communities, have to overcome hate. I want to come from a place of empowerment and really look at how activism is something that is so intrinsic to our identities. So the image you see in front of you is the Gersik Temple. In the 1950s, this is probably one of the earliest images we have as its whole self. The Gurdwara began construction in 1908 and finished in 1911. So it was a 3-year project. And the reason why it took so many years to build was because there were only about 30 or 40 Sikh men who were able to build the Gurdwara. It did take so many years because they carried the lumber piece by piece based on they worked for a local company called the Abbotsford Lumber Company, which was half a kilometer stretch down the hill. And so that's why it took 3 years of building. Some of the men might have been these men that you see in front of you. This is one of the earliest images that we have of the Sikh settlers in the Fraser Valley. This is in an area called Claiborne Village. These men arrived in Abbotsford in the Fraser Valley around 1905, 1907. And like I said, the lumber industry was where many of these men were hired. It was during a time when a lot of racialized people were only given certain labor jobs, and that too paid much far less than a lot of their white European counterparts as well. So they were paid a fraction of the cost of wage, though they did work in that industry. Some of the local settlers in our community include Nanda Singh Banga on the left-hand side and his partner or wife Tankor. And they were one of the earliest settlers in the Fraser Valley. In fact, they played a really prominent role in the building of that heritage Gurdwara. Their children are here in the picture as well. They have some of the most iconic images in our community. Bimbanga is, oh gosh, he's got to be about 85 years old now. And if you are lucky enough to meet him, he'll still share stories about his dad and his family's history. On the right-hand side, you see Sunder Singh Tandy riding his tractor here in the Fraser Valley. Also one of the more prosperous families in the Fraser Valley. They helped to donate to the Gurdwara. They helped to construct the Gurdwara. They were part of purchasing the land of that original property of the Gurdwara as well. So these are some images of people who were a part of that history. And to this very day, play a very prominent role in the Abbotsford community. But let's talk a little bit about what those nuanced histories are in the Fraser Valley, right? This is the Canadian Race Relation Foundation, an organization that I'm very grateful for because it's one of the few organizations that offers transparency and truth when we talk about racism. So the Abbotsford Lumber Company, yes, hired many Sikhs, in fact, all of the Sikh men who lived here in the Fraser Valley. But the Abbotsford Lumber Company's patriarch also happened to be the founding member of the KKK in Abbotsford. And what's really interesting is that we don't shed light on these histories. This is a well-known newspaper article, has been fully accessible since 1925 when it came to be, but our community in Abbotsford tends to whitewash these histories. And I was a part of that whitewashing as well. When I've been doing tours of the Heritage Gurdwara for 12 years now. I happily told stories of the great Abbotsford Lumber Company and the Trethewey family and how generous they were in donating the lumber. I partook in this narrative without realizing that there was a history of KKK in the family and that there was a history of also firing almost 40, however many, 40 to 50, quote, Orientals, as you see in the left-hand side article. Many of those Punjabi Sikh men, they let go of those Punjabi Sikh men when there was a narrative and a push through organizations like the KKK and the Order of the Brotherhood to get rid of all racialized workers. These histories are really important when we talk about resistance through the Gurdwara spaces. So yes, the Abbotsford Lumber Company did donate the lumber to help build that Gurdwara. It's an important piece of our history, but at the same time, there is a push of the KKK presence taking place. And when we look to these histories of white supremacy, we don't realize that Canada too had these organizations. And so you can see a newspaper article that provides that archival evidence. So yes, these men were let go after a very long history of working with the Abbotsford Lumber Company. Men like the image that you see here, also one of the earliest images of Sikh families in Abbotsford. You'll notice they were almost all men. And I want to emphasize part of that history of racism against Sikhs in particular, and also other racialized communities, was a denial of unification, right? A denial of families being able to be brought here. It was up until at least 1923 that Sikh women and children weren't able to join the men. So when we use words like bachelor society, men being in these spaces, it wasn't by design. It was by, I should clarify that. It wasn't by choice, it was by design, right? It was by state design to say, we don't want women and children to come because that means these men will create a permanent presence here. So images like this, you will see 95% men, and then way in the back, I see about 3 women. It's very hard to see. It's almost like a ghost or a whisper of who these women are, what their stories are, right? But this is what the communities were. And these conversations that are taking place in this Gurdwara is what I want to talk about when we talk about activism, and what Imroze and I are going to chat about more as well. What were some of the conversations that took place in the Gurdwara, and why do they matter? So this is an example of the front of the Gurdwara before I talk about some of those conversations and why I want to emphasize the physical appearance of this Gurdwara. As far as I can tell, this is the only, or as far as I know, this is the only Gurdwara or Sikh temple that looks the way that it does in the entire Western Hemisphere for certain. And what it is it's paying homage to the way the earlier buildings looked 100 plus years ago, but inwardly, the architecture, the sacred space, the concepts of the Sikh faith are true to what the Sikh faith upholds. Now, outwardly, it has a false front and it has a gabled roof. Very few buildings, especially in Abbotsford, exist that look like the way the pioneer buildings looked 100 plus years ago. We're very proud that we managed as a community to keep this site intact. There was conversations of trying to sell this property, and thank goodness, wiser people prevailed and we were able to preserve this site. So it is a National Historic Site of Canada, which means it's designated by Parks Canada and kind of protected under that umbrella. So it can't be torn down. It is protected and it is given that site of significance. Remember when I was talking about those activist spaces, right? This is a really cool story that I want to share. So every Sikh Gurdwara in the world has a Nashan Sahib. You may know of the very large flag pole that you can see from very far away. Nashan means a marker. Nashan means a symbol. And the original Nashan Sahib is the wooden stump that you see on the left-hand side. So when the Gurdwara was built, it was an 80-foot wood stump with a little light bulb on top. Now, 100 years ago, Abbotsford was all flat lands. It was mostly dairy land, it was farms, but that Gurdwara was selected to be on top of a little hill because the Sikh men said, we want this Gurdwara to be seen no matter where you are. Imagine the foresight, imagine the self-preservation, the power of these Sikh men to say, we may be getting fired from where we'd worked for so many years, we may be facing racism, we may be abused, but we're going to select a place where everybody can see it. I think there's something really powerful about that. And that's what they did. So they selected that Gurdwara on a little hill. Now the Nashan Sahib, the flagpole, was even higher. We've heard stories that there were Sikhs who were coming from the American border, which was around this area, a few kilometers down the Sumas-Washington border. And they were called Gaddarites. So a Gaddarite were revolutionaries in the diaspora. They were South Asians who were fighting against British colonialism in India. They were called Gaddarites. Gaddar means mutiny or rebellion and revolution. These Gaddarites found the light bulb on top of that wooden pole and walked their way from America to this Gurdwara space. And it's what took place in the Gurdwara space, which is where the revolution was. And what they did was recite poetry. Some of the most powerful, beautiful, revolutionary poetry you could imagine. Poetry about the racism they faced in Canada, poetry about the racism they faced in British India, and how they were going to overthrow the British. And they did that in these walls. So yes, it was a place where you found community, you found your sangat, which means community. It was a place where you found sustenance through food, where you wouldn't get it otherwise. It was a place where you, had a place to sleep during a time you had just arrived and may not have had that. But there was something else that took place in these walls. And that to me is what these walls reverberate and vibrate when I walk through them and give tours around this space. So yes, it is about the racism. Yes, it is about how these Sikh men wanted to create a safe space for themselves. But they did something else with that too. They wanted to react and they wanted to make change as well. Now, what's happened since is in 2011, we converted the ground floor into a fully functioning museum. So not only is this a National Historic Site, it's a fully functioning Gurdwara upstairs. As you see on the left-hand side, there's an image where we always have people come at every exhibit launch and take place upstairs first in the Darbar Hall and then make our way downstairs to the exhibit opening. It's a beautiful transference of where food was served to now knowledge being served. And so now the Langar Hall has been transformed into a fully functioning museum where I have the honor and privilege of co-curating exhibits once a year. The exhibit that you see here was an exhibit from last year or 2 years ago called We Are Hockey. And it looked at the history of race and racism in hockey, something that you perhaps wouldn't equate with being at a Sikh Heritage Museum. But through looking at, Hockey Night in Canada Punjabi and the power of the Punjabi language, we were able to curate a beautiful exhibit. And actually, Imroze and I are working on some extensions, or had been last year, to creating new content, because there's been so much that has happened in the last couple of years with hockey in Canada. These are the sorts of examples of how I would argue activism is being updated in these spaces, right? We're talking about different forms of knowledge making and knowledge production as a form of activism in the very spaces where revolutionary poetry was read out, where langar was served, where the Sikh men said, this hill is going to be where our Gurdwara is. I think there's a beautiful threading of histories to be had here. And I also want to say, it isn't just a space for Sikh community members. I've been giving tours to every community member you can think of, including elementary school students. Just a couple of weeks ago, I did a school tour, and it was a majority non-Sikh classroom. And the teacher replicated the walking and the carrying of the lumber in her class. So she had her students carry a lumber from the mill where the Abbotsford Lumber Company was to the Heritage Gurdwara. And they met me there and we did a tour. And it's the first time ever a teacher has done that. And it was some of the most powerful empathy making exercises I've ever witnessed. And these were grade 5 children. So I think there's so much beautiful potential in this site. And I think there's, you know, an ever breadth of exhibits that we can do. The current exhibit that we have is the story of the Komagera Maru. It's a pretty common known history, I would say, when we look at like the history of racism against South Asians and the Sikh community. And what I want to highlight is it's not our only history, right? I think we tend to homogenize histories of racism in Canada against Sikhs and say, well, there's the Komagera Maru story. But, you know, the story of the Gurdwara helps highlight how there are so many more nuanced stories about our communities, but also stories of resistance. And even with the Komagera Maru, when the communities were fundraising for the lawyer, J. Edward Bird, when the community was fundraising to, you know, purchase supplies, water for the passengers, every Gurdwara that existed in British Columbia, and there's only a handful then, maybe 5 or 6, would pool their funds together in the Gurdwara spaces, just like this Abbotsford Gurdwara as well. So once again, you know, resistance to Canadian state racism is a form of activism as well. So I know because we started late, I'm going to end here because I do want to have more conversations with Imroze and chat a little bit more about that. So I'm going to end there, and then we'll chat more with Imroze about, you know, Sikh history and activism.
Yeah, no, Sharanjit, first of all, thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, yes, like you said, we've known each other for a while, so I know some of this stuff, but at the same time, it's very nice to kind of get the refresher because, you know, sometimes you get like, you forget, like, you know, where you're coming from because you haven't heard the stories in a while. So it's a nice way to kind of get the refresher. I think it's very like iconic in a way that how the Sikh community, especially just like focusing in Abbotsford too, like has been very iconic in a way to like questioning the state since day one. And that sort of reflects back to, you know, just like Sikhi in general, you know, when we think about like how old the quote unquote the religion is, it's actually one of the youngest like religions to exist. I mean, if you want to put it in context, the Babur's invasion happened at the same time when Guru Nanak Sahib Ji was they were doing their you know prachar, like they were going around like cities and stuff, and they were questioning things, they were helping people understand things. So that is kind of puts some things that like this is very fresh in context of history. So when we think about it, you know, think about like where Sikhi came from. Sikhi directly is an answer to oppression. That's where it came from. Sikhi is, I like how Harinder Singh put it from Sikhri. He says that, and it's in Bani too. It's in the scriptures of Guru Granth Sahib as well. It says that Nanak Raj Chalaya, like Guru Nanak Sahib started this new sovereign way of you know revolution. That's how we call it. It started a revolution of self-governance. That's what he meant by Sikhi. So I think it's from day one we've been questioning. Guru Nanak Sahib questioned Babur. He questioned caste. He questioned every living thing that contradicted the oneness. So that is one thing that we like. That's where we're coming from. So it's when people ask us like, why are you always questioning things? And it's like, because it's in our blood. Like it's our go-to thing.
That's such a great point. Sikhi, I want the audience members who may not know, right? The word, and you would be better at explaining this than me, but it means to learn, right?
Yeah.
Sikhna, Sikhi. So the very word of our faith is about questioning and learning. And I think that comes from a place of humility, which means that we don't have all the answers. So isn't it beautiful that we can continue to ask the questions? Right?
Exactly. Yeah, like, so the word Sikh is actually Persian. It's Farsi to learn, and Sikh means to learn, and then Sikhi is all about learning. Like, you're constantly on a journey of learning. So actually, I'll kind of like get right into our first question too, Sharanjit.
Sure.
So like Sikh Dharam, the faith, like since its inception, has been about questioning the authority and the state. Guru Nanak Sahib laid the foundations of Sikhi on the pillar of truth. It comes from Bani, it comes from the scriptures. When we look at the lives that Sikh Gurus lived, they lived in activism. The Sikh Panth, the community, has been taught that too. That's what we've been doing. You know, the Gurdwara Sikh, the Gersik Temple in Abbotsford is a living example of that. So how do you think that has structured our narrative since day one?
Yeah, I think you answered actually some of those questions really well in the beginning. But what I want to say is that, you know, we forget to revisit these histories, I think, right? Like, using words like activism, revolutionary, for some reason has negative connotations. Like, it's being wrongly co-opted in so many ways, the language of activism. And what I always say is, activism is this beautiful spectrum. We don't have to fit our activism into state boxes of what is acceptable in terms of activism. I believe in activism on the streets. Amazing. I believe in activism through word. I believe in activism within academia, or activism through the arts. And I learned that through the history of our Sikhi and the history of our gurus, who each created activism through creating like our Gurbani, our language, activism as langar, activism as physical fighting, right?
Yeah.
Like, we can't choose one just because it suits our comfort. No, we have to have the full spectrum and understand the context in which it was used.
Yeah. No, it's you know, it's about understanding the duality of it instead of the binaries, because, you know, duality is the part of the oneness, and that is the Sikh ethos as well too, like oneness, accepting that whatever is surrounding us is also in us too. The universe that's made of, that universe is made of this energy, and the same energy is in us too. So that is, sorry, go ahead.
I want to jump off of oneness, because once again, I don't know who the audience is, and I always talk about oneness when I do tours. Imroze's word oneness is really important, because in Sikhi, we don't use the word God. Like, when we think of the word God, me personally, it reminds me of like the Judeo-Christian God, which is not the same as the way when I use the word. So I stopped using the word God even at home. Like, I'll say Jod, which means light, or oneness. And to me, oneness encapsulates this idea of the oneness of humanity, the oneness of the universe, the oneness of Mother Earth in connection to us. And so Imroze is saying that very purposefully and specifically, I feel.
No, so the oneness is the beginning of, you know, the holy book that we have called Guru Granth Sahib. The beginning of starts with Ek Onkar. That is the translation of it is oneness, and this oneness is without gender. It's without the concept of time. It is truth. It's a forever being without shape and anything. So that is the oneness that's surrounding us, and that's the oneness that's in us too. And that is where, you know, that is the original revolution. That's the source of our activism at the end of the day. Want to transfer back more into activism part. Each guru, we have 10 gurus, and then we have the scripture that is our guru as well. I think each guru did their own version of activism, considering the time and the timeline they were going through at that time. And I want to come back to this idea that's very much a duality aspect of it too. That's very much kind of gives us an inspiration or a source of fuel for our activism too. And it sort of goes back to our sixth guru, Guru Har Gobind Sahib Ji, and the concept is Miri Piri. Miri means spirituality, and then Piri means political, the political and spiritual aspect of it. And that's what we've been taught by the gurus as well, that they both go hand in hand. You can't pick and choose one thing. And that sort of goes back into activism too. So I want to talk to you about how, like, what does activism look for us, for considering, we are in 2022.
Yeah.
2020, wow, okay, 2022. And things are, we're doing these panels on Zoom now. We have access to the whole world. So what does activism look for us, especially with the meaty in our mindset?
I loved your comment about, making it a duality and not making it a binary, right? Like, so what I've noticed since 2020, June of 2020 in particular, is that, especially in terms of anti-racism, right? It was the anti-racist movement taking place. There's been a lot of performances everywhere across, let's just say Canada. That's the context I've been observing very carefully, and in the name of activism. So, activism as performance only. And I think to pull ourselves out of that and to become truly anti-racist, I use my Sikh identity as a push to navigate me out of the performance into the acting part of activism. So I engage in both. I have this practice of calling out to call in, as opposed to, people like to call in and then I do the opposite. I like to call people out first, and then I'll say, okay, now I'm ready to have a conversation with you. And what I need people to understand is that's what I choose. That's my spectrum. And you may not be okay with it, but you have your own spectrum. But the reason why I want to be more active is because I'm tired, Imroze. Like, I don't have patience anymore. I have zero patience. When I see the anti-Blackness around me, when, the comments Mohammed made about acknowledging, the harm amongst young Indigenous people, and just looking at the Wet'suwet'en land defenders here in British Columbia, I'm tired, and I no longer have the energy to engage in passive activism. So my activism is very much rooted in that, spiritual, but also in your face kind of form of activism. And that's what I choose.
Yeah. It's it's very important to understand the duality of these things, because yes, you can, it's great to show up, but sometimes you need a lot of fuel, like the patience that you talk about, like, that we're losing at the end of the day, because we've been, not that we as in like we, but like we as a bunch, that the Sikh community itself has been putting in a lot of emotional labor at the end of the day. So where is this fuel coming from? And that's where spirituality kicked in. That's when the meaty kicked in. So that goes very hand in hand with each other, because you can't have spirituality and you not reflect on political aspect of the life that you're living in this world too, because you are in this world. We have to observe the surroundings too. So to make sense of things, spirituality is there, and to make sense of spirituality, there's a politicalness too. So that's how I see things.
But also, when you say political, right, I think people assume like, oh, we're going to run for liberals and we're going to run for, and that's not what you're talking about. Like in the Sikh context, right? I want to make that very clear. Political means like an astute awareness of, I don't know what another word for politics is, but astute awareness of the climate, socially, culturally, yes, politically, but it's so much more than just running for politics. That's different. Yeah. Right.
That is, I would say that's also a very colonial way of thinking it too, because when I actually think of like being political, there's a very Sikh element attached to it, and that is self-governance. That's what I mean from being political, and being sovereign in my own mind state. Because if I'm not sovereign, if I'm not self-governed at the end of the day, I cannot help my community. It starts from within. So that is what I mean by politicalness. But yeah, thank you for that. Moving forward, and especially, you touched on the Gersik Temple and then the beautiful history that it has. I'm originally from Abbotsford. I've moved around a little bit, but like I love going to Abbotsford. I still work out of Abbotsford. So I generally would like, sometimes bunch of my friends will just like head down to Abbotsford. We'll do like a day in Abbotsford, go explore things. And then I will also purposely take them to the Gersik Temple as well, and show them like this is like, you know, this is where my people are coming from, like my people. So it's very nice. So like to share all of that too. And I think just going back to it too, like gurdwaras, not just the Gersik Temple in Abbotsford, gurdwaras in general all around the world play a very pivotal role in Sikh community. Different aspects of gurdwara facilitate a very specific role. And over time, due to colonization and some of the aspects, you know, like practices have disappeared or are slowly fading, actually. So how can we bring them back? Or what do we, you know, not even like bring them back, but like what do we need to keep in mind as we're bringing some of those practices back? That's the thing. And how does, you know, kind of related to like resistance too. So yeah.
I love that question. So I would say a couple of things. One is we need to stop making any religious space a space to be feared. Like when I was growing up, you know, and I think this is in a lot of religious spaces, we have to act very proper, as though we are being observed and judged. You know, in the Gurdwara, I wasn't allowed to touch the Guru Granth Sahib Ji or, you know, be really engaged. Do that with my children. Like I let them, you know, once they wash their hands, do the Chor Sahib Seva. I let them like engage and not be fearful. That's really important. Accessibility to our Gurdwara, accessibility to the Guru Granth Sahib Ji, without creating fear is really important. Number one, there's too much like policing, I think, that and gatekeeping that takes, and that's what happens when you, I think, politicize, and here I mean actually politicize gurdwaras, right? Or any religious space. So one is accessibility. The other thing is, you know, when I talked about the Gadarites, those who would follow the light bulb and come and recite poetry, I want us to return to a place. Gurdwaras can be spaces of engagement. Our community is a very oral-based community. Like a lot of the men, here's what's fascinating. Those Gadarites could not read or write. There were a handful of people who were creating these publications out of San Francisco, mostly, the Gadar publications. Every single one of those poems were memorized by those men. And I'm talking like 5 pages of poetry memorized verbatim.
Yeah.
And that is something so beautiful and sentences for the life of me, right? Like it's a beautiful methodology, a beautiful skill set. We don't do that in our gurdwaras anymore. Let young people come. Like imagine having a young art curator like you come to a gurdwara space in the Darbar Hall and give a lecture about, you know, things. Young people.
Yeah. And I think for context too, when we say Sikh temple and Gurdwara, I will kind of explain what Gurdwara means. So Guru is someone that takes you from darkness to light. So that is Guru. So the Ru is darkness and Guru is someone that takes you away from darkness towards light. And Dwara means doors, passage. So Gurdwara literally means a passage, an intro, the door to the Guru, to the enlightened being. And Gurdwara the purpose of Gurdwara wasn't just a place of worship. It's technically supposed to be a community space. You know, it's supposed to be a place of learning. You don't have to worship there all the time. That is there, but there is, you know, originally it was set up as a hub, you know, like education will be provided. I remember there's some Gurdwaras in Tarantan, my parents will tell me in Punjab, in India, they will tell me that, you know, during like around 84, when, you know, there was a lot of civil unrest happening and the genocides were happening, you know, the classic Indian trope there. So what was happening was a lot of students, a lot of kids weren't able to go to school. And that's when the Gurdwaras kicked in. Gurdwaras were providing those classes. They saw that like, okay, these kids are getting a bit like they're growing up. They need some skills. So they started teaching them like sewing lessons. They started teaching them carpentry like classes and stuff. So that was another way of like mobilizing it. But that is why, like when I look at the Gurdwaras these days, especially in the West and like even in the motherland too, I feel like we have lost the plot with that.
But you know, Imroze, what you're saying reminds me during the farmers' protest, and I know we have to save time for questions, so I'll let you manage when we have time for Q&A from the audience. But for those in the farmers' protest, the Delhi like protest site became a mobile gurdwara. And for people who don't know what happened, unprecedented. Our communities were giving food to everybody in that Delhi area, including those who were destitute, who didn't have homes, who were, living in quote slums. Little children were being educated. And when the farmers left, everybody was crying. It was this emotional kind of breakage. And that is what gurdwaras are. You go where your sangat is, right? You go and feed and build knowledge as
the
well.
Unconditional support, no matter what. So that is no, thank you for like reflecting on that. I think that was very, very important for this. I think we also need to, we kind of touched on like the gurdwaras here and like how we're slowly transforming them as well. I think you and your kids are a great example of that too. So that you're sort of like recreating this beautiful relationship with Gurdwara. I think it's important to kind of touch on like the history and the purpose of activism. Like, we're talking about Gurdwaras, and there's always talk of, langar, and people hear, when they hear langar and they hear free food.
Yes.
And I want to talk about like what this free food is. Free food, this langar actually was started by Guru Nanak Sahib with his sister Bibi Nanaki to feed people, not just any they weren't just like grabbing people like, hey, come, I'll feed you. They were like, you are in need, let me serve you food without any conditions. They weren't accepting any money or anything. They were generally just feeding people. And the idea was to feed like the hungry, like in the physical sense. But langar is also something that, each Guru Amar Das Sahib and Goindwal Sahib, the great, Akbar, the ruler at that time, came to visit. And Guru Amar Das Sahib said, before you go into the Pangat, before you go and sit in the Sangat in the Gurdwara in the Sikh temple, I want you to go eat langar in the hall with everyone. I want you to eat. So this big ruler of India at that time, Akbar, sat down on the floor with everyone else, ate food with everyone else, and then went and saw Guru Sahib and in the Gurdwara. So I think that is very like revolutionary in a sense.
Huge.
Too.
Think about it. 15th century, maybe early 16th century, right? A ruler, a Mughal ruler is being asked to sit and eat, regardless of whose caste was around you, regardless of whose gender was around you. It's revolutionary in 16th century to have that. And to initiate that, I think our gurus were they were pushing the limits of people's expectations. And food, it's not just food, it's revolution through food.
And the idea of that was to like, you go eat food first, you go to the langar, eat the food, and then come to the Gurdwara, because now you have physically fed your body. So now nothing else will distract you. So now you have time to feed yourself with spirituality. That was the goal of langar as well. So, thinking about the history and the purpose and the activism through langar, why does it matter that we honor those foundations?
Because I use the word whitewashing in my presentation a little bit. And I'm just, we tend to sanitize histories to make it comfortable for people, or to try to fit into a box of our perceptions. So food is such a good comment, because Vaisakhi just passed this month, right? Vaisakhi is the celebration of the birth of the Khalsa Panth. It's the reason why we, have the outward form, the 5 Ks of the Sikh faith, those who are baptized as Khalsa Sikhs. We have the biggest Nagar Kirtans or parades that take place in Surrey. Outside of India, Surrey has had the number of bodies come there to celebrate the Khalsa Panth. But what we always get focused on, or what the media focuses on, is look at the chole bhature, look at the food, look at the popsicles, look at this. And, it whitewashes the meaning of food as revolution. It whitewashes this fact that we are giving so much just because we love all our communities, but can we not erase the fact of what the foundation is and what the story of the Khalsa Panth is? So I just want to avoid simplicity. We are very smart people. Everybody is capable of going on their phone and reading beyond the first 2 sentences.
Yeah.
People are capable. And I push all of us, no matter what you're learning about outside of your own histories, to push beyond the first 2 sentences and really engage meaningfully.
Yeah, 100%. Kind of want to focus back to, to you again and talk about the Sikh Heritage Museum. Yeah. I've been there multiple times. I was actually there about 2 weeks ago. And I want to, that place holds a very special place for me because I think when we moved to Canada, we lived in Vancouver for a bit, but this one time we were visiting Abbotsford, and that was my first intro to Abbotsford. That Gersik Temple on South Fraser was the intro to Abbotsford. And I was in the whole environment. I walked around, and it absolutely blew me away that we've been here for such a long time.
Yeah.
For me, someone who grew up in Punjab, we moved to Canada, I thought that it's going to be, it was going to be rough. I'm not going to lie, it was rough, but, seeing a Gurdwara, seeing Gurmukhi and English right next to it made me feel like, okay, it'll be fine. So that place, like every time I drive past it, it just gives me like, doesn't matter what it is, it gives me like a sense of peace, like, yes, it'll be fine. It'll be fine.
And belonging.
Yeah.
Like and creative belonging, which I think somebody like you, there's a special sort of attraction there because it's a space of creativity now. Yeah. And I think that's where we're headed. I think that's a beautiful place we can head as a Sikh community, is to forge a creative path. And that Sikh Heritage Museum is like this nostalgic past, but it's also this like possibilities of the future. And I love that space. So I hear you. It is a space of belonging. Yeah.
It's a beautiful place of belonging, which is also a safe space as well. So I think that's very important to understand. So I want to kind of talk to you about like what makes Sikh Heritage Museum a unique place of history, memory, and activism.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of some of the themes historically about why, the walls speak. The walls really do speak, right? But for me, it's just the hope of what we can continue to do in that space, what can be fostered. My dissertation looks at museums, and I need museums to also understand the power of this space, right? Like I think we can totally flip our understanding of how museums can function, or institutions can function as well. And that Gurdwara offers that. When we do exhibit openings, it doesn't matter who comes, we will all go upstairs and do darshan and matha tek before anybody goes downstairs. And that is just part of that process of care and respect. And when you said Gurdwaras are safe spaces, we don't proselytize. I've been proselytized too while giving tours of the Sikh Heritage Museum. Sikhs do not proselytize. We do not believe in that. We believe those 4 doors of entry are there because you matter.
Yeah.
Your faith matters as well, and you are welcome in these walls. Yeah. And I think that's something I'm so proud of as a Sikh, that we don't do that. We come, meditate, do what you want to do, respect, of course, the place you're in, but you're welcome. And so, I think I just encourage people, anybody, to come visit that site.
Yeah. No, I feel like I'm hyping it up because I'm very biased. But it is, I think if you're ever in the Valley, Abbotsford, definitely go visit. Like it's a beautiful, beautiful place. And it definitely helps you find like your own space to like, where do I fit into this? So that is great. I feel like we've given folks like almost a crash course in Sikhi 101 at this point. So I kind of want to just like sum it up like a little bit more. Because my next question is activism in Sikhi transactional? Yeah. And I kind of, before you answer, I kind of want to give folks a little bit of like background too. Guru Nanak Sahib, the very first guru, he is the foundational person, this foundational being, this entity that started the revolution called Sikhi. And looking at things from like EDI perspective, it's a beautiful like it's the faith itself is very inclusive in its own. A lot of things happened, wars were happening, and through Sikhi, it wasn't that like, oh, I'm not going to help you because you're not Sikh. Like, people helped and beyond. There's a beautiful statue at the Gurdwara, at the Gersik Temple of Bhai Kanhaiya Ji, who during a lot of wars, during Guru Gobind Sahib time, he would serve water and ailments to the soldiers who were wounded. And besides, if they were Sikh or Muslim or Hindu or anything, he would serve them no matter what their religion or caste was. And I think for me, that's very like, he did it because he said that when Guru Sahib asked him, like, why are you serving? Why are you feeding them? He said, because I see the light in them. And that is without the religion and anything too. Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib, sacrificed his life in the middle of Delhi for the Kashmiri Pandits, the Hindu Pandits too. So just using that as an example, I want to return the question back to you, Sharanjit. Is activism in Sikhi transactional? And I want to reflect in a modern context too, showing up for people. Yeah.
Yeah. When I saw this question, I sent Imroze a message saying, this question is fire. I love this question.
Fire emojis.
Fire emojis. I do love this question because of the word transactional. And I think, we're all kind of facing this conundrum within our own communities, within our own families of, we've got so much stuff to deal with in our own. Why are we helping others? Like this weird kind of repositioning of what it means to be an activist. And to me, antithesis of what it means to be a Sikh, right? Going back to this idea of oneness, if you are doing this for the oneness, if you are doing this for the betterment of a whole humanity, no matter how long it takes, no matter what it takes, you don't ask that question. You don't position it by saying, well, they're not doing it for me, or, well, the whataboutisms, basically. So no, Sikhi is not transactional. The foundation of who we are is revolutionary because we are not transactional and because we work from a place of oneness. Our text, our Guru Granth Sahib Ji, is the only spiritual religious text in the entire world that has authors in it who are not Sikh. Right? We have Hindu pockets, we have Muslim Sufis, we have Sikhs, of course, we have our gurus. It's the only religious text that offers knowledge from people of other faiths. We didn't say convert to write in our text. And I take that to heart, very much so. So no, we are not transactional. We should never be.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to kind of reflect in the modern context too, because, I remember in June 2020, everybody had, blacked out their profile pictures. Everybody had BLM mentioned in their in their profiles and everything. Not that it's a bad thing, but the thing was, when something similar happened to a Sikh person, a lot of questions from the Sikh community were raised, like, hey, like, we supported you during BLM. Where is your support? And to me, that was something that like irked me a little bit too, that your support is transactional at the end of the day. And that is not something that our gurus, Sikhi, this revolution has taught us. Our goal is to, love love is such a beautiful thing. Like, if you make love transactional, you will never have it.
Right.
It needs to be unconditional. So that is the ethos, that is sort of the spark of activism. At the end of the day, you show up. And it's not transactional.
Questions from the audience?
If I was going to mention, like, if there are any questions from the audience, there is one question that I see. And the question is, will exhibits and permanent items held in museum be digitized and available to be viewed similar like this tour?
So we've actually just created at the South Asian Studies Institute a South Asian Canadian digital archive. It's a first of its kind in all of Canada, I think, modeling the South Asian American Digital Archive, SADA. And so we have put like one of our exhibits digitally, the exhibit on the vote. And our goal is to make every single exhibit we've done accessible digitally. So it'll be available all across Canada. So it's going to take many, many years, but 100% we're working on that.
Wonderful. If there are any more questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A.
I think there's a question in the chat, Imroze. What can we do as members of a minority community to ensure our history is not whitewashed? Challenge. You have to challenge. You know, that what I found is if one person has a question or has a critique, 50 other people do. But unfortunately, those 50 other people aren't always able to speak up or be the ones to speak up. So it does require a synergy and a movement of collective minds questioning together. So if you have a question about something, if you read something or see something and say, I am being erased here, or my experience, my nuance of who I am is being erased, you're not the only one feeling that or seeing that. The problem is society or psychology, whatever it is, we're so fear-based that we don't want to call it out. So you do really have to create a synergy and a momentum to start challenging collectively. The good thing is we are in a time and place where you can really do that. And people are actually somewhat walking on eggshells, as they should be, because it's about time they're held accountable to the things they do, I feel. Yeah.
No, it's the, I think this question is like also very that's a tough one, because I've sort of been in this situation before too. And like, you know, they always, you know, people always try to like see like, okay, like what is like when I try to explain some of the Punjabi or the Sikh elements that I'm really, really like attached to, they're like, so like translate, like dumb it down for me. And I'm like, actually, it's not like that easy, because, you know, it took me a very long time to understand it for myself. And I put a lot of work into understanding these things, and you just want the fruit like right away. And that's why that sometimes, you know, I like made some really great friends out of it too, because they showed like keen interest in it, and I took them on the journey. I explained them to them. I think that's one thing. So if you're expecting someone to open up, you should be able to do that same for them as well. So I think that is like a hand-in-hand thing. So yeah. There's one more question. How can we forge better relationships with other communities that are using their place of worships for activism work as well?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm always for forging relationships and forging and building stronger relationships, especially relationships that are built around activism and resistance of systems. To be very honest, I don't know if you know, Imroze, I don't know a lot of religious spaces. So that's my ignorance, how they utilize resistance and what methods they use to talk about, you know, anything of that nature in religious spaces. That's because I have a misconception that religious spaces are often oppressed spaces, unfortunately, right? So I would love to know if there are those conversations taking place, not from a place of oppressing more, right? So I'm really mindful of that.
Yeah, there is. I remember this one time my dad was telling me he grew up in Tarantan, and during 84 it was the ground for it was in a very rough position at that time. It was the center of, I would say an epicenter of the quote unquote like the unrest. And remember this one time the prime minister, I think the president of India was visiting the Gurdwara, the Sikh temple in Tarantan. And one of the raggis, one of the preachers in the hymn, the person who sings the hymns, he, like what had happened at that time with the attack on the Harmandir Sahib, the Golden Temple, and the mass genocide. He was like irked by it. Like, how can you show up to the Gurdwara after all that your state has done? And in his power, with all the resources that he had, him being on the mic with his harmonium and his access to Bani, his access to Guru's word, he sang this beautiful shabad that directly made the president feel guilty. And the shabad was Kutta Raj Behaliye. That means the dog is sitting on the throne. And what happened was that backfired on the Ragi as well. He lost his prime position, prime time of performing the Shabad or Kirtan. But at the same time, he knows what he did. That was a pure source of activism right there. He questioned the authority in his safe space. And that irked the state to a point where he did not perform Kirtan at all after that, because they just wouldn't give him the spot. So I think there's thinking about, that was just one example that I have in my mind right now, but I think that kind of gives us a direction on like how we can use those places for that.
Yeah. Oh, such a good story. Yeah.
I think there's one more question.
One more question? Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about your dissertation, Sharanjit?
Sure. Yeah, I'll be quick. I know we have to end. So my dissertation compared 3 sites, museum sites in 3 Asian Canadian communities, shaping of their own belonging in museums that are for them, by them, essentially. So I looked at Chinese Canadians, Japanese Canadians, and Sikh Canadians through the Sikh Heritage Museum. And what it is basically a case study or a guide for how all museums can become spaces of belonging by decentering white historical narratives in their spaces. And so I challenge museums to say these communities felt this for the first time ever in a museum space, and it's something that you too can foster. So in a 2-second nutshell, that's basically what my dissertation looks to is, and I do it through affect, which is like a emotional way of feeling belonging through your race.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, there is one more there, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. 2 minutes.
Yeah. How do you feel about curators of knowledge transfer that through Sanghat's interpretation of Guru Granth Sahib Ji, implication of changing Guru Gurbani's textual records, hence meaning emerge and threaten fracturing Sikhi further into different Sikh denominations? This question stems from a Sikh book club trying to change and more so print sarups that are not sanctioned by SGPC.
Oh, Imroze, you want to take this one?
Why don't you start?
Okay, so this is very much, knowledge that a lot of Sikhs would have, I think. So the person asking is obviously, I'm guessing, from the Sikh community. The thing about our Guru Granth Sahib Ji in our text is that we treat it like it is we treat the knowledge contained within it as if it's a living, breathing human being. We wake it up in the morning, it's put away at night. It is given such care and tenderness and respect. And so the question is more about this growing movement to print more copies. And I feel like there's a way to create a balance without losing the love and tenderness and care that we have, without having to print an abundance of copies for the sake of quantity. Like, I think there are ways you can access the Guru Granth Sahib Ji digitally, creatively. There are groups like the Sikh Research Institute that are doing so much in terms of Gurbani. So I do worry as well the physical need to just create quantities and quantities of the Guru Granth Sahib Ji. I also question the SGPC a lot as well. Like, I also have problems with this seat of authority, which itself is corrupt and misogynistic, whatever. So those are some of my thoughts. Imroze. Yeah.
I'll quickly, just like 30 seconds. I think there is a very, like, SGPC, like, Guru Nanak Sahib's purpose of, starting this revolution was to take the middleman out. Like, we don't need, like these, like, different, like, like Brahmins and everything to access the word. Your relationship with Guru Granth Sahib and the oneness is through the Guru Granth Sahib, through the holy book, right? So for me, SGPC should be providing us a framework on how to, develop that relationship, in a different way of understanding it too. So if we're trying to do books, then they should have a framework for us and, like, okay, this is what you can do and cannot do. But then we also, as a Sikh, it's our duty to look at SGPC's relationship with state as well. SGPC's relationship with state goes deeper each and day, like, and that is something that we need to question as well. But at the same time, it's how do we kind of take back Akal Takht from SGPC at the same time? Like, and or maybe how do we decolonize SGPC at the end of the day? That is some of the things that we need to think about. But one thing that, you know, the words being changed and the Bani being changed, that is obviously like obviously it's a bad thing. I mean, the word is being changed, but at the same time, it's up to us to kind of understand like our relationship with Guru, with Granth Sahib, like you mentioned, Sharon, our living, breathing thing that is our Guru. Our Guru is present with us at that time. So I think that is an important relationship that we need to understand. But yeah. Yeah, thank you for joining us. Yeah.
Are there closing, Hannah probably has closing remarks.
Yes, I do have closing remarks. So thank you both so much. Thank you to the audience for participating. Those were really great questions and pushed the conversation for sure. Imroze and Sharanjit, it was awesome to have you, and unfortunate with the delays at the beginning, but I'm glad we were able to recover and have this conversation. And also, congratulations becoming a doctor. I wish we had put that in your title, because that is definitely earned. For the CCRF, we just wanted to make clear that we do have a commitment towards financially supporting community initiatives. So we do have funding available for youth initiatives, sponsorship through the National Anti-Racism Fund. So the funding streams, there are different funding streams and different criteria for each of these programs. But if you are interested in learning more about accessing this funding, you can visit our website at www.crrf-fcrr.ca for more information. Also, we encourage you to sign up to receive our regular newsletters, to remain updated about our events and programs. And in the meantime, you'll get a survey to fill out so that we can hear your thoughts on our programming going forward. So again, thank you for attending, and we hope you've learned something new or found the discussion inspiring. Bye, everyone. Thank you.